U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 2, Hard Times, 1929 to 1932. When the Great Depression begins, millions of people lose their jobs, or they take pay cuts to keep their jobs, because at this point, companies around the nation are beginning to fail. They don't have the money to be able to spend to keep their employees paid and keep their businesses running while still making profit. So they're going to end up firing some of their employees. The ones that they do keep, they're not going to be able to continue to pay them at the same rate that they were paying them, so they need to give them a pay cut. From 1929 to 1932, unemployment grows exponentially. For example, 1929, the general unemployment rate was approximately 3.2%. By 1933, it jumps to 25%. A quarter of the American population is without a job. Now, at this point in time, the American population is somewhere around 124 million people. A quarter of that is around 31 million people. That's 31 million people in the United States that don't have a job and can't feed their family. And at this point, this leads to many Americans starting to lose hope. They're losing confidence in the future. And so while in the 20s, we see this extravagant era of monetary spending, people are going out and buying all kinds of fancy stuff. They've got more disposable income, which is when you can have more money left over after you pay all your bills. And they go from that to saving every dime they possibly can. And the decline in consumer confidence makes this depression last much longer than many people believe it should. It lasts for around 15 years. And it's not until we're in the midst of World War II that our economy really begins to see an uptick. And while many people think that the Great Depression was very much only an American-centric idea or concept, this is actually a worldwide phenomenon. The Great Depression leads to a global depression throughout the world, including in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The reason for this, in part, is World War I. We've seen how World War I ravaged Europe. Germany is having to pay back war reparations, so they're basically having to pay back a war that they're blamed for. So they're still doing that in the 30s. And then Great Britain and France are still rebuilding. Everybody's still trying to pay back loans. And world trade ends up falling by 40%. So if you look at our chart over on the top left, the blue line is world imports, the red line is world exports. In 1929, world imports, which means bringing goods into your country, are somewhere around $35 billion in that year. Exports, which means sending goods out to other countries, is around $33 billion. By 1933, imports are just about $12 billion, and exports are maybe $11 billion. So you go from 30-something billion to like $12 billion. That's over a 50% drop in that case. In order to encourage more Americans to buy American-made stuff instead of their foreign counterparts, we start passing more high tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports and exports. So that means that if an American wants to buy some cloth to make a dress from Europe, they're going to put an extra $1 tax on that. So you can buy the same cloth that's made in America for $5, but it's going to cost you $6 to bring it over from the United Kingdom. That's just an example, but it helps you to understand that if you buy something from overseas at that point, it's going to be more expensive. For For this reason, many European countries are not making the same amount of money from the United States as they once were. So to respond to our tariffs, they set their own tariffs, which makes it then difficult for American companies to sell in other countries. Because a tariff is a tax on imports and exports. So not only in this case are you going to be making more money buying in the United States because you're having to pay more taxes if you get it from overseas, this also means that selling goods overseas by American companies is going to be higher because other countries are putting high tariffs also. And at this point, people simply do not have the money to buy the stuff. The Great Depression leads to a huge collapse of the American financial system by 1933. This begins with bank failures. Americans start losing confidence in the banks. Because on Black Tuesday, when you went to go try to get your money out of the banks didn't have money to give you. Partially because so many people were rushing the banks that the banks simply didn't have enough cash on hand. But also, a lot of banks in the country were being pretty backhanded, and they're selling and buying stocks on margin with money that doesn't belong to them. This leads to 25,000 banks across the country failing. The lack of banking means there's no money for investment because that's where you would get a loan to start a business, for example. So because the banks are closed, now you can't invest in properties or businesses. This then leads to a lack of spending because you simply don't have the money. And the crash leads to the failure of 90,000 businesses because people aren't spending as much money at different companies. Those companies then cannot afford to stay open, so they end up closing. When the company goes bankrupt or closes, all the people that worked for them now are out of a job. So unemployment peaks at 25% of all Americans. Because of this, people start losing their homes, they start losing their farms, they start losing their businesses. Because if you lose your job, it's going to be a ripple effect in the economy as more and more people start to lose theirs. All of this leads to record amounts of poverty and suicide in the United States. To the point where people are living in what we call shanty towns, and we're going to look at some photos here in a second, where they're just getting any material they possibly can and trying to build a house out of it, build shelter out of it. Soup kitchens and bread lines are set up by many charities just for the sole purpose of feeding people because people don't have the money to buy food anymore. You get billboards like this one that says, "Jobless men, keep going, we can't take care of our own." Chamber of Commerce, that is a city organization that's saying, I'm sorry, we do not have the money to be able to pay you. You're going to have to leave. We're not going to be able to hire you. When mortgage foreclosures begin to happen, because people can no longer pay their loan, people are having evacuation sales. So they would literally sell everything they had, and then you end up with people living in tents or in ramshackle structures because that's all they could afford to live in. And then poverty begins to run rampant. People are dirty, they are unkept, they just don't have the means of taking care of themselves, and they're also hungry. The effects of the Great Depression were made worse by the Dust Bowl. Decades of over-farming because of the need for production during World War I, as well as massive droughts, which are extended periods of time with no rain in the Great Plains, lead to huge wind and dust storms that sweep away the soil that made the farming possible. Now, this is because of a couple of reasons. Yes, we are over-farming. Over-farming leads to situations where people are not taking care of the soil that they're using to farm. So instead of a farmer separating his 4 acres into 4 single-acre plots and then only planting 2 at a time, that farmer is going to plant all of them. This leads to a lot of the land being devoid of its normal foliage. So instead of having grass that's going to hold that soil in place, that's just dirt now. And so when these huge windstorms come up, because there's no rain, it's going to blow up huge dust clouds, and that's what's going to be called the Dust Bowl. Farmers in the Great Plains called Okies and Arkies, Okies being from Oklahoma, Arkies being from Arkansas, leave their farms in droves and search for work in better land in the West Coast areas. So as you can see, the heart of the Dust Bowl is the panhandle of Oklahoma, the corners of Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and then the top part of the panhandle in Texas. That's the hardest hit area. As you move outwards, you get other areas that are severely damaged by the Dust Bowl, and that's, a large portion of West Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, up into Nebraska and South Dakota, and a little bit of Wyoming. These people can no longer afford to keep their farms because they're not able to actually plant their crops and get a good crop going. So a lot of these people start leaving because, one, they start hearing there's work in California, which there very well may have been at the beginning, but as more and more people start moving that way, less and less jobs are available. But a lot of people are packing up everything they own just to go out west in hopes of finding work. When the Great Depression begins, we have a Republican president, Herbert Hoover, and he tries to solve America's economic problems. Hoover believes that America could overcome the Depression through rugged individualism, using hard work and perseverance. Basically, if you work really hard, eventually you'll work your way up and you'll get out of your situation you're in. And Hoover starts setting up private charities to help. Or not setting them up, but encouraging them to help in this volunteerism. So if you work really hard, you're going to end up getting out of your situation, and then you can volunteer and you can help other people that are in that same situation. He encourages business growth. He wanted to keep taxes low, and he wanted to avoid direct government intervention. He has a very pick yourself up by your bootstraps and move on kind of concept. And here his quote says, "Economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement. Economic wounds must be healed by the actions of the cells of economic body, the producers and the consumers themselves." So what he's saying is a very laissez-faire or lazy government mindset. The government needs to stay out of it and the people will take care of it on their own. All the while, the people are screaming that they need more government assistance. The government needs to help them out. As the Depression begins to worsen, Hoover calls for more direct government action to ease people's suffering. He's like, okay, I get it. My idea's not working. Maybe the government does need to step in some. Under Hoover, the government starts issuing relief checks to help the unemployed. So the government is giving money to unemployed people to help them out. And this is very similar to some of the other governmental regulations that have happened in the past. For example, during the George W. Bush administration, at one point he offered some extra money on your tax returns to help out. Congress also creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. And the purpose of this organization was to help out failing businesses by giving them a loan. We're going to give you money, we're going to bail you out, we're going to help you, and then once you get back on your feet, you can pay us back. So if you look at our chart, this is real federal spending. This is under the Hoover administration. So as you can see, when he's got his rugged individualism, lazy government idea in the 20s, we've got about $3 billion that the government's spending. By 1934, that's upwards of between $8 and $9 billion. This is when in 32 is when he's really trying to help out because it's an election year, guys. He wants reelected. 34 is when Franklin Roosevelt is in the office and things are actually starting to change. Congress also begins to approve new building projects. And the goal of these projects is to, one, help the areas in which they're building them. Also to help put Americans to work so Americans can have a job. One of the biggest ones of these projects was the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam is a dam that was created on the Colorado River just around the area of Las Vegas, Nevada. And the purpose was to be able to create hydroelectricity and also give people jobs. These efforts, however, did not end the Depression, and many citizens really kind of see this as too little too late. Like, look, Hoover, we asked you for help. You said, trust me, prosperity's just around the corner. But yet you don't help out. You basically say we need to do it on our own, and when you do try to help us, man, we've already been in this situation for so long that your little bit's not helping. So they lose faith in him. Americans who lose their homes begin to live in shanty towns, like the one at the bottom left. And they nickname these towns Hoovervilles after President Hoover because they blame him for the reason why they're living there instead of in their homes. They also have Hoover blankets, which are, like, for the people who are sleeping on the streets, they're newspapers. And then Hoover hotels are basically just like the Hoovervilles. They're like the houses, the individual houses in the Hoovervilles. And basically anything that's bad, they name after Hoover because they feel like he's not doing enough to help them. 1932 is an election year, and that's part of the reason why Hoover starts trying to help ease the tensions and ease the issues, because he wants to get reelected. But Americans are looking for new leadership. They want a president who's going to help them, who's going to be proactive, and who's not going to be laissez-faire about things. So the presidential election in 1932 comes down to the Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Republican candidate Herbert Hoover. And as you can see by our electoral map here, Hoover only wins 6 states out of 48. Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets 57% of the popular vote, but 89% of the electoral vote. He wins all of the states that have the big electoral college numbers except for Pennsylvania. So he wins 89% of the electoral college. Basically, he wins by a landslide. And it's Roosevelt, as we're going to see as we move forward, who really comes in and actually begins to help the American people and does some good things. We'll talk about that as we move through Unit 5. This brings us to the end of Unit 5, Lesson 2. Hope to see you back here for Lesson 3, and I hope you have a great day.